Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, I must have to start, first of all, two things. I mean, well, first, apologies for the length of the text. If anybody tried to sort of grapple with all of it, it's hard enough just to read any of it, I think, but to attempt the whole thing is quite a challenge. It's a very wide-ranging text and not the most enjoyable one to read, as Jung actually admits, doesn't he, somewhere towards the end, said it's not the fundamental discussions are among the things that mold a science into shape, but they are seldom entertaining. And maybe perhaps that does sum up the text a little bit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I don't feel I've particularly got any real illumination to offer, in the sense that this is a text that I feel continually defeated by. So I'm really taking the opportunity to sort of raise some of the issues that I find interesting and difficult in this text, and hope that in the discussion, from my point of view, that I can get some fresh perspectives on it. But you know, so what I propose to do is I want to focus, if possible, on section 7 and thereabouts. But I'm happy to talk about any other parts of it that people feel relevant. But in order to put it in perspective, I can very briefly just sort of give a sort of lightning tour of it. I mean, very briefly, just to say, you know, a sentence or two about each of the sections that lead up to section 7. I mean, well, I'll introduce the text itself to begin with, and then do that, and then hopefully we'll have some pickup on some of the issues that are in section 7 and beyond. So the first thing I think to say about it is that this was a late text of Jung's. It was delivered initially as an Eranos lecture, which may be significant. It was originally titled "The Spirit of Psychology." It's 1946. So this is Jung in his 70s, with all the sort of main elements of his theoretical model in place, and his critical periods of, you know, his Red Book experience and his near-death experience behind him, and so on. So this is late Jung, when he's had an opportunity to put his whole model together, and it seems to have something of the character of an attempt to set out his position, his theoretical position. This is his most mature account of his overall theoretical position, and it covers a range of things, like early psychology and the early philosophical influences and so on. But you know, these seem to be influences on Jung rather than influences on psychology as such, because he's writing this in 1946, and he doesn't really refer to much 20th century psychology, apart from, you know, his own and some other depths, you know, perhaps a bit of Freud and so on. So he's not actually engaging with contemporary psychology very much. I think that's worth noting. But there's but he covers a wide range of material, as I say, and I'll just go through some of what's in each section. We start off in section 1. It's called "The Unconscious in Historical Perspective," and that's basically what he does. He gives a historical perspective, and essentially he's talking about how the psychology of the unconscious, well, how psychology as a discipline arose, but then how psychology of the unconscious arose, and how it became an empirical discipline rather than something that philosophers and theologians speculated about, the nature of the mind, nature of the soul. So that's kind of what he's doing in the first section. Then in the second section, he's called "The Significance of the Unconscious in Psychology." He talks about how the introduction of this idea of the unconscious was important for, I suppose, the way we, epistemologically, for the way we acquire knowledge. It sort of implies that all knowledge that we can acquire is necessarily incomplete. So if there is an unconscious. Also, interestingly, and I'll come back to this, he credits the origin of the idea of the unconscious to Frederick Myers via William James. So that's sort of just worth noting. The next section, section 3, the dissociability of the psyche, it sort of affirms that the psyche is dissociable, and how that gives rise to the idea of secondary consciousness, which will be important. That there's not just the consciousness for Jung is not a unified thing, but is there are the possibility of more than one center of consciousness. So this is an important notion here. And he also, in that section, also introduces an idea. I think this is his first extensive discussion of the concept of the psychoid concept, and he refers to it in its early. He refers to sort of previous thinkers' views of it, such as Bloiler and some others, but they're predominantly sort of biological accounts of it. At the point at which he introduces it. Section 4, called Instinct and Will, builds on the idea of the dissociability of the psyche to pick, and he sort of draws on a bit of Freud and mainly Janet's idea of the superior and inferior parts of the psyche to develop this idea. The section is called Instinct and Will, the idea that that there is a distinction between the sort of instinctual part of the psyche and a part which through consciousness one gives one a certain control over psychic energy and psychic processes, and gives one he talks about the disposable psychic energy, as it were, and disposable by the will, which implies a sort of a center of consciousness. And he concludes that section by suggesting that this, contrary to what he said earlier in the paper, might suggest that psyche is equated with consciousness. If psyche is, the psyche proper is what is able to resist the instincts, or the instinctual part of one's nature, then that may suggest that the psyche is equated with consciousness, which he's previously sort of questioned. And he then further questions it in the next section, called Consciousness and Unconscious, in which he gives a sort of pretty standard, I think, account for him of the distinction between consciousness and the unconscious and the evidence for it, and so on. And but eventually comes to some interesting points about how consciousness and the unconscious are not so distinct. That contents, all contents, he seems to suggest, are both conscious and unconscious, that they have the contents that seem to be conscious also have an unconscious element, and he suggests that contents that seem to be unconscious are also have a conscious aspect, in the sense that they behave in ways in the same way as conscious contents. So he develops this idea that there may be a multiplicity of centers of consciousness, and that's how that section ends. It's then picked up on in the next section, section 6, which is called the unconscious as a multiple consciousness. So this is the idea that the unconscious, in a sense, has this multiplicity of centers of luminosity, he calls them, so there's a sort of a multiple consciousness. This is a very interesting sort of notion, which he amplifies. I mean, this section is really his sort of obligatory alchemical interlude. So he sort of amplifies this idea with a load of sort of alchemical and other theological and cultural references. So he develops that idea. And I mentioned earlier that he credited Frederick Myers with the origin of the notion of the unconscious psyche, or the subliminal consciousness, as Myers called it. And interestingly, this idea of a multiple consciousness, or an unconscious that in some sense is also conscious, is very close to the view that Myers was expressing. So I mention it because I think there's a further influence of Myers in this paper, which is the possibly cryptonesic or possibly plagiaristic use of the analogy of the spectrum, which you find in the way in which Jung uses it. This is the, where he says the instinctual aspect of the psyche. The instincts are at the infrared end of the the sort of psychic spectrum, and the sort of spirit and the archetype are at the ultraviolet end. This sort of metaphor of the spectrum is something that you find in Frederick Myers, using almost identical sort of language and so on. So maybe Jung picked it up from there. But so there are several indications. I just mentioned sort of 3 indications that Jung was influenced by Myers. Not an influence that he credits an awful lot in his work, but it is interesting in that that Myers' view of the unconscious is one that sees the unconscious, or the subliminal consciousness. The very word subliminal consciousness hints at this as something that is like another kind of conscious center, which is not sort of unconscious in the kind of way that one sometimes might attribute to Jung. So it's an interesting and insufficiently explored notion, I think. So we come at last to section 7, and that's where I think one of the most interesting sort of parts of the paper is, where he's talking about it's titled Patterns of Behavior and Archetypes, and there are so many things one could talk about in here, but he makes the distinction between instinct and archetype, or he talks about the archetype in sort of biological terms as like the biological instincts, but notes that the instinct itself is sort of inaccessible, and that and this he associates with what he calls the infrared end of this spectrum model, but that the instincts have images that are associated with them, and he gives an example from the leaf cutting ants that has its sort of image of its activity, and this is he says is sort of inseparable from the instinct. And he sees archetypes, or he suggests that archetypes are as it were the images of instincts. So he closely ties archetype here to biology, to biological assumptions. And this is interesting because later in the paper, as you go on into the supplement via this section 8, which is called sort of what's it called? General considerations and prospects. He starts introducing more consideration of physics, and eventually starts talking about Pauli's ideas and complementarity and the relationship between psyche and matter. So he seems to shift within the course of the paper from biological to a physical understanding of physics understanding of archetypes. So there's something interesting about that, in the sense that these are quite different sort of scientific perspectives that he's trying to, in some way or other, synthesize within this paper with what degree of success maybe we can think about. But just to go back to section 7, he suggests that that you've got this distinction between instincts on the one hand and archetype on the other, and he suggests that one cannot directly sort of engage with the instincts, but one can engage with them through the images that they express in the form of archetypal images. And he sort of elaborates here. It's one of the places where he elaborates on his technique of active imagination as the way of investigating archetypal images, and he explains how he does that. He emphasizes certain things about the archetypes, that they're very importantly that they're numinous, that they've got this sort of spiritual charge about them, and that they spiritual nature, spiritual character, and this is something that he again sort of elaborates later. He talks about the the importance or the danger of splitting or identifying with one part of this sort of archetype instinct polarity, and this resulting in a sort of a one-sidedness, which can be addressed, he suggests, by the process of realizing the shadow, the sort of the part of oneself that one doesn't want to engage with. And he sort of elaborates on the ethical aspects of this confrontation and attempted integration. This leads him on to talk about the need to synthesize conscious and unconscious contents through what is ultimately his process of individuation. And then towards the end of the chapter, he makes some distinctions which had been long needed to be made, but he hadn't made them clearly, I don't think, before this point. One of which is the distinction between the archetypal images that one might experience and what he calls the archetype as such, or here also the psychoid archetype. So the psychoid archetype, he emphasizes, is something that one cannot experience, but is like the sort of the ground theme. And then the archetypal images are like variations on that ground theme, a multiplicity of potential ways in which that archetype as such can be expressed. And this seems to be the locus classicus where he makes that what in the end is an important distinction. Then he sort of starts moving into more philosophical territory and talking about the relationship between psyche and matter. And he talks about these as two different. This is one of the places where he expresses his view, which can be sort of elaborated as a form of dual aspect monism, where he talks about psyche and matter as being two different aspects of one and the same thing, i.e. there's an underlying unitary reality that expresses itself in these two different forms of psyche and matter. It's not that that one of them is prior to the other, but they're both sort of expressions or manifestations of in our experience of an underlying reality, which is ultimately unitary in his view. So he sort of elaborates that point there, and he also importantly elaborates the idea of the at its ultraviolet end, the archetype and the image of the instinct is not something that can be considered to be purely psychic, but is can best be referred to as spirit, as something that has the sort of the autonomy from being purely psychic, as it were. There's something that seems to be transcendental about it. In fact, he says that both matter and psyche are transcendental in relation to the phenomenal experience of them through the psyche. The ultimate nature of both, he says, is transcendental, and they, as it were, spirit and matter confront one another, he says, on the psychic plane. So there are a lot of quite sort of important and profound things that he says about the nature of the archetype and the nature of the relationship between psyche and matter in this chapter, in this section, I should say. Just and maybe that's what I'd like to come back to most, if in the discussion, if people are happy to. Just to conclude this sort of preamble, just to say a little bit about the final sections. He talks in section 8, the title, General Considerations and Prospects. He sort of focuses mainly on the importance of psychology for world affairs. He talks about the psyche as being the world's pivot, and if we don't understand that, he sort of hints at the sort of catastrophe that could result if we don't sort of grasp the significance of that. He also talks about the difficulty of understanding the psyche, the fact that when you're doing psychology, the psyche is understanding the psyche. There's no objective point. One is inevitably involved. The psyche is observing the psyche, so there's no sort of vantage point, and this makes it a particularly problematic area to study, and introduces the idea of what he calls the personal equation. And then in the final section, he sort of talks further about the nature of psyche and its relationship to matter. He starts off sort of innocently, really talking on a sort of an epistemological level, talk about how, you know, the fact that we can't know the psyche, know the archetype directly doesn't mean we can't say anything about it in the same kind of way as we don't observe subatomic particles in physics directly, but we can infer lots of things about them and construct models and so on. So he starts off in that light, but then sort of warms to the task of talking about the relationship between psyche and matter, physics and psychology, and starts comparing the two disciplines and drawing parallels between them, and elaborating on the idea that that when he talks now about the psychoid archetype, he's implying that not as he had done earlier in the paper, that the archetype is that what he means by the psychoid is a sort of a point where the psychic nature of the archetype sort of dissolves into the physiological substrate of the organism, as it were. He's now talking about the archetype as being a factor that structures in some way matter in general, not just in an organism to which a psyche is attached, but matter in general. So it's a much broader understanding of the nature of the archetype as not just a psychic phenomenon, but a psychophysical one, or one that structures from some deeper level both psyche and matter in the broadest sense. And that he elsewhere in subsequent writings, in letters, in later papers, he elaborates that sort of idea, or repeats that idea, I should say, a number of times more. So that, you know, there's a sort of tension between that way of thinking about archetypes and perhaps his more biological way of thinking about them. If nothing else, that should give a flavour of the complexity of this paper and the number of difficult issues that are sort of at work in it. So, I mean, I'd just be interested to know what people's responses have been and what questions people have come up with, and hopefully we can explore them together.
If you put your questions in chat, I'll try to keep up with that. Otherwise, if you use the hand raising function, try to keep track of that. Steve?
Hi, thank you, Roderick, for that. It's really interesting text. I think it's about 20 years since I read this text, and I did read the whole thing. There was quite a lot to it. There was one thing I wanted to ask you about this dual aspect monism, because one of the books that I sort of spend a lot of time delving into is Psychological Types, where he introduces his philosophy of esse in anima, which basically is about the creation of reality being between the knowing subject and the external world, and through the interaction of them and through the interaction between interactions. It seems to, two questions about this. One is, it seems to me that this text is a turning point where he really turns to this idea of dual aspect monism. Am I right in thinking this is the turning point, or is there something else that actually is the foreshadow of that? And the second question is dual aspect monism a replacement for his previous philosophy of esse in anima, or do they actually operate at different levels? So esse in anima is more sort of a pragmatic philosophy of how we create reality. And what he's doing with this dual aspect monism is looking behind that to see what the fundamental nature of reality is. So the two double-barreled question there.
Okay. I mean, this is first of all, I think the first thing is that Jung is he's not systematic in his philosophy by any means. So he's so the neat idea of him having an idea, a philosophical viewpoint, and then sort of it being superseded in a clean way is perhaps is more than one can expect. But this is probably the main period where he's thinking about ideas that suggest dual aspect monism. He never, of course, uses that phrase, but it's not the earliest. He uses the expression as far back as the early 1930s, actually. In papers, he sort of talks about this idea of psyche and matter being two aspects of one and the same thing. So it's not a new idea, and the idea is often attributed to his engagement with Pauli, but in fact these earlier uses are before he was even acquainted with Pauli. There are uses. So he was thinking along those lines, and there were plenty of sort of philosophical precedents around that might make him think of that. Gustav Fechner might be one example, for example, whom he does mention in various places. But it was his relationship with Pauli that made him really think about that idea. I think that's where he starts talking about the idea of a unitary reality, which he would then in his later work called the unus mundus, and then how that sort of can express itself in these different epistemic ways of psyche and matter. So yeah, I think this is the point at which he most talks about that. You find these kind of statements more frequently around this time, but it's not the actual source, I don't think. As for the relationship to the essay and anima, I mean, you're probably right. I mean, Jung was exploratory in almost all the philosophizing that he did, in that he didn't try and I don't think he tried to sort of take a philosophical position and then see how that made all his work, all his other ideas consistent. I think he was more just trying to make sense of particular debates that he was having, and he worked out these ideas in correspondence with Wolfgang Pauli mainly. But even in his debate with Pauli, he still is prioritizing the psychic perspective. I mean, he even when they're sort of working out these ideas, which you can articulate as his view of dual aspect monism, he's still saying that in some sense the psyche has priority. Pauli wanted to affirm that matter was as important as psyche as a perspective. He thought Jung was overemphasizing the psyche, and Jung sort of conceded by bringing physical more into his framework, but he wanted to polarize it with spirit in some of what he wrote, and to see psyche as a sort of mediation between the two. So with what success, I don't know, but I think he was probably trying in some way to make those different ways of thinking compatible in his mind. But yeah, so I don't know if that's of any help, Steve, but
that's great, thank you. I might at some point just get the early 1930s references off you, but that's for another day perhaps.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Sulagna, you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Roderick, thank you for this.
Nice, Sulagna.
Yeah. Roderick, I have two things to say. One is a comment and one is a question. And For the comment, I just observed that in the first part of this paper, Jung talks about the soul, and he introduces instinct into the concept of soul, and this I thought was a very important difference between his view of soul as psyche and the Eastern concept of soul, because in the Eastern concept of soul, the instinct, the end of instinct and body is the beginning of soul. So the process of thinking about soul begins with the question of death and the separation from the body, and also the separation from instinctual life. And it takes on to the question of afterlife. And so that is the Eastern concept of also connected to self, soul, afterlife, beginning from death, separation of body. That's an interesting difference. And I really liked Jung's, this chapter so much, because it brings a completely different perspective about what soul is, if it is connected to instinct. And what he does throughout the paper is keep both of these together in kind of a relationship. So that was one. The question that I had for you was, throughout the paper, Jung seems to have described different kinds of consciousness. There is subconscious, there is personal unconscious, there are fringes of consciousness, there are luminosities or different kinds of different consciousness, multiple consciousness. Then he's talked about collective unconscious and collective consciousness. So in all this, there is also psychoid, which is that point of the psyche that cannot be made conscious. If that is, if I have understood it correctly about the meaning of psychoid, if that is so. And then he describes, I think in the last section, in the last 3 pages somewhere, he says that when that part of the unconscious, which is not possible to be realized or to be made conscious, comes in direct contact with, or becomes conscious through a process of synchronicity, the psychoid it disappears. That part that is not realizable as consciousness, that disappears, because the moment it becomes conscious, it's no more psychoid. So he describes consciousness in a kind of a fluid, continuous way in different kinds of positions. And what would you say about the meaning of psychoid in this sense of consciousness or unconscious?
Okay, thank you for your comment and the distinction with the Eastern way of talking about it and Jung's way. That's very interesting. Of course, Jung, he again, there's this sort of a question of precision or how he's using language, and I think both your comment and your question actually sort of bring that out, because when Jung's use of soul, is he using the word psyche, or is he using the word Seele, or what is he actually using there in the German? I'm not sure. And his different way of understanding him, because of course the word anima also means soul. So there is the sort of the question of how to pin down what he's saying there, and I enjoyed what you just said about consciousness, because I think that helps to explain some of the difficulty of actually grappling with this paper, that there are so many different ways in which he's talking about consciousness that sort of come up in different contexts, and you nicely enumerated quite a few there. In relation to the psychoid, I think what you were referring to at the end, that when he says that when that synchronistic phenomena occur in some sort of under the
Yes.
influence of the activation of an archetype,
Yeah.
as you would put it, and then when one becomes conscious of the process or the complex or whatever it is, that then the synchronistic phenomena disappear.
Yes.
This sort of idea. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really him talking about the sort of resolution of the tension within, you know, that's between consciousness and the unconscious, and when you become conscious of something that has been trying to break into consciousness, and I guess have the opportunity to integrate it in some way, then the phenomena that needed to bring that to your attention will, you know, could be a symptom, it could be a synchronicity, it could be certain kinds of image or a dream image or fantasy or whatever, that is no longer necessary to express the content, because you've in some way got a more conscious relationship to it, so then it would disappear. I think that's kind of what he's saying. In relation to the concept of the psychoid and consciousness, I mean, he does say that you're right, that's what he says, that there is that it's that part of the psyche that can never be conscious, or about which one can never be conscious. So I think his thinking there is that it's that, you know, for something to be conscious means that you can discriminate about it, and you can differentiate it. You can differentiate it into psychic and material, or into you know, here and now, or rather than somewhere else, somewhere else. But I think those distinctions he's suggesting at this level of the unconscious don't exist. So there's no, you know, there's no possibility of knowing, as it were. Yeah, but I mean, but those were, I enjoyed those comments actually, because they really do pick up on the complexity of what he's saying in this paper,
and thank you for bringing this paper. This is I mean, this is such a, like you said, it's so complex and so interesting.
Thank you for your, yeah. Hi, John.
Yeah. Hi, Roderick. Yeah, this particular text is more like a book. Is what I've struggled with too. This is, at least in my writings here, I believe this is the first time he introduces the notion of the psychoid in his writing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
But there may be, I think there are some, you know, earlier allusions to the idea, but not quite in the sense in which he comes to use it here.
I guess this is what I find to be the most convoluted aspect of his I'll call it philosophy, even though he doesn't, because it's so he's trying to find the point that connects and I think unifies everything. So this is where he also expands his theory of archetypes. It's like, this is his lunchbox here now. I mean, the archetype used to be kind of just the image or the symbol, and now it's everything from, you know, instinct or drive to feelings to emotions to thought images to the whole kitchen sink's thrown in, and he makes it's intimately connected to the transcendent, and the transcendent's always out there. It's meaning that its point of origin is it precedes the subjective psyche. You either buy into a system or you don't buy into it. So to me, he prefaces or privileges the objective psyche, which is part of the collective unconscious, which is in many ways animates all of humankind's consciousness, as well as our unconsciousness. And that's where the archetypes have to emerge from, but they emerge within psyche. And in my view, I think he's trying to try to find that center unification principle. Of course, he has to make it, the ding and zeek. You can't know it in itself. You can only infer it or infer what it does, the functions it serves, things like that. But is he really advancing his argument when he makes the archetype everything now? And is he advancing, a more clear distinction about, I think, unconscious processes that are behind the scenes? And I'm not sure the psychoid makes it. So, for instance, why does he call it an archetype? Why would he make the psychoid an archetype rather than, let's say, it's an unconscious ego, for instance, that does things behind the scenes? That would be, I'd like to hear how you might respond to that before I drone on about another thing.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to just that last point, I mean, he uses the word psychoid adjectively, and he this is what he says in section 3. The previous writers, such as Bloiler, had used it nominatively. Nominally, they'd used it as a noun, the psychoid, as though it were something. But he uses it adjectively, stresses that, and he uses it actually adjectively with a number of things. He talks about psychoid factors, psychoid archetypes. He occasionally uses the phrase the psychoid unconscious. So it's a sort of he's not necessarily, he's talking about it as it's a sort of a way of characterizing something, So he's really, I suppose, he's talking about a quality or of inaccessibility, and as you say, an inferred quality of sort of unification, or where there's a sort of a level beyond certain distinctions. Certainly beyond the distinction between psyche and matter. So why he talks about this, he's not saying that the psychoid is an archetype as though there is something. Psychoid is an adjective that's qualifying the word archetype. It's a particular way of understanding the concept of archetype that he's already got. I don't know if does that at all clarify what you were asking, or?
Yeah, that confuses me actually,
Okay.
because I mean, to assume that I think he does refer, at least in other places, to the psychoid as an archetype.
As an archetype. He talks about the psychoid. He talks about the psychoid archetype, but what he means is the archetype which I'm considering psychoid, not the psychoid as an archetype in the sense of as, like the self is an archetype or the anima is an archetype.
Okay, so if he does that, he's making an archetype an entity or an agency, and hence it occupies, a psychoid presence. I don't see I don't see how you can neatly distinguish psychoid from an archetype, but maybe you can.
You mean the concept of the psychoid archetype is a bit redundant? You mean? Why does he need to call it, and why does he need to introduce this additional idea?
Yeah, so if he's making archetypes kind of like these unconscious process entities, these kind of fluid forms, they are the things that are organizing and populating our unconscious life.
Mm.
And so the move I would try to make would be try to make the psychoid the thing that's animating or trying to unify contents and processes in the psyche as more distinct from the form itself. But again, that might be my own problem here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the word psychoid obviously literally means psyche-like, and he uses it because he's seeing the archetypes as not being purely psychic. He's now seeing them as being, in the first instance, kind of physiological, and then outright physical as well, or not, or something that can't be considered just purely psychic. That they structure psychic events, but they also structure physical phenomena as well. So this is why he's calling it psychoid, that it's kind of like psyche, but it's something more and deeper, and you can't simply call it psychic because it's also it touches on the realm of matter. So I think that's what he's fundamentally getting at, and in that sense, it is a conception that is attempting to articulate a level of unitary reality, if in the sense that it's trying to articulate a level which is prior to the distinction between matter and psyche. And in view of some of the other things he says about it, he's also seems to be suggesting that it's prior to the distinction, between temporal and spatial distinctions as well. I mean, that's another sort of vector in his thinking about this, which he doesn't emphasize here so much.
So are you using the term psyche in Jung's sense as like an immaterial entity, or isn't psyche permeate the material as well?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I think. I mean, it's in what sense? Can I just clarify what sense you're asking that? I mean, what sense you mean that?
Yeah, I guess it's the issue is a lot of these discussions around psyche and matter tend to be about material versus immaterial discourse.
Yeah.
When I think Jung, by this time in his life, is trying to collapse that bifurcation.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to differentiate out pure matter from mind. And so he's trying to he's pulling a Neoplatonic move, a Hegelian move, or a German idealist move.
Yeah.
Of wanting to have something account for everything. And I'm just not knowing where it's grounded in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I think he's definitely grappling with that problem of what is the relationship between matter and psyche, and how can they be conceived in a way that they're not a dualism, and also they're not one taking precedence over the other, as it were. Because I don't think he's articulating an idealism, and I don't think he's definitely not articulating a materialism. So how can he do that? And he, the question that Steve raised earlier about dual aspect monism, that's one way in which he articulates that. But there seems to be a bit of a tension, actually, in some of what he says between that way of framing this and another way, which I think is reflected in what you're saying, where he also says things like all of matter has a psychic aspect, and all of psyche has a physical aspect, so it's almost like a sort of a kind of panpsychism or a cosmopsychism that he's talking about. But that's something different, actually, from a dual aspect monism. I mean, I'm not sure whether the two are reconcilable, but I would think they're actually different, because the dual aspect monism is postulating an underlying reality of which psyche and matter are different, sort of different aspects, whereas the other is not necessarily postulating that additional third unitary reality, but rather that there is a sort of, it could be a monism that's just everything is both psychic and physical. It's a psychophysical monism, if you like. So it may be a slightly different model. So I'm not sure Jung, you know, because he's not a philosopher, and he's not thinking, you know, sort of rigorously about these things. I mean, I think his main impulse, as you say, is to try and find a view which is not splitting the matter from psyche, but is seeing them as, in some sense, part of a unitary reality. But how that's conceived, you know, there seem to be different formulations. I think the dual aspect monism one is the one that works best, actually, in my view. But you know, I mean, other people may disagree with that. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Barbara?
Oh, fine. I think I'm going to go on a little different track.
Good.
I want to move into the mythogem, where what is important, I think, for Jung in his understanding for the archetype. What I'm thinking about is, you know, if we're talking about organizing images, well, what organizes images? Well, you know, it's the plot and it's the story that organizes images. And that makes me think about, well, you know, what is he doing? What is Jung doing with this distinction between the instinct and the archetype? My sense of what he's doing is that he's saying for humans, the instinct is no longer a complete story. So now what we need to get the thing going, to get the whole pattern of behavior going, we now need a trigger, and that trigger is now story. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure yet where your question is coming from. Is it coming from part of this paper, in the sense that what are you responding to? Maybe I misunderstood or didn't hear.
Well, Jung seems to be, explaining why he needs the archetype as a concept.
Yeah.
And then he's saying, well, what is the instinct? And then he's saying, what is the archetype? And what I think makes me understanding of why we need the concept archetype is what I think Jung is maybe not saying explicitly, but it's kind of implied, is that that the instinct is no longer a complete story for humans.
No, I see. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So then there's a lot of what he's saying about what is numinous, and of course the numinous is what is the trigger. About what is actually the numinous. He's saying it's the archetype, but what is the archetype? I think he says also somewhere that let's just call things what they are, always been called. Let's call them shadow. Oh, I think I could say, why don't we call archetype what it's always been called, and that's ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole thing about ancestors is their story.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, are you sort of elaborating the idea? I mean, when he talks about instinct and will, doesn't he? He talks about sort of the liberation of psychic energy through consciousness and getting the ability to resist will, and I suppose it's from that will resist instinct, and that's from that you develop cultural forms, and that this is where myths and stories and other kinds of cultural forms would come in. Is this?
I don't think that's what Jung is talking about, this resisting of instinct.
No.
I like what he said very much at the end there, just before the supplement. He said things differently than he's said before. I think you're right. He's doing things a little differently. As one sentence is, individuation is gathering the world to you.
Yeah.
So I would say that's a cultural form. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's done in story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what you seem to be saying about the ancestors and mythologians and so on, I like, and that's and I like that way of thinking about archetypes, in a sense of these powerful patterns that sort of grip and shape the way shape activities and so on. The way I've read this paper, or my reading of this paper, I don't see that very present in this, actually. And when he talks about active imagination, he talks about how he encouraged, how he developed this technique and encouraged people to do it. And he talks about the archetypal motifs that emerged in the process, or out of, that he distilled out of that process. He talks about very abstract things. He talks about quaternities and dualities and good and evil and the opposites and so on. And it's very abstract terms in which he writes about it. And then he has a sentence afterwards and says, I can't remember exactly what he says, but something like, anyone who studies this area will if it looks at the material, you'll see the whole of world mythology included, but it's not exactly included in the way that he articulates it, which is at a very sort of abstract level. So it's the way I read this, or the way I saw it, he seems to be sort of in some way trying to theorize the notion of the archetype at a level of quite deep abstraction, which takes it away from that more vivid and embodied way that you seem to be intimating. But I mean, it seems you've seen something else here that is more supportive of that. Have you? Is that?
I don't know if I've seen it there in this chapter. It's my intimation of Jung being a real going back in his thinking, be a real the beginning of Protestant movement. And at the beginning of the Protestant movement, there was, okay, we're not going to follow tradition, because the Pope is the Antichrist. So what are we going to do? And so I think what Jung is picking up is what they said they would do, that we're going to turn to revelations. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that there is a stream of ecstasy in Protestantism, which is always underground. And so I get my sense, that Jung is, he had his ecstasies, he had his Red Book experiences, and now he's putting that underground. That's not so, it's not so, well, let's say, just say embodied, as he probably experienced these things.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Shall we move on to Billy? And
Okay.
you need to unmute.
Oh, sorry, was that me you were coming to, David? Yeah, okay. I wanted to pick up on the idea of the numinous, and it struck me very much in this work and in others that the numinous is very definitely put at the violet end of the archetypal spectrum. And it always seems to have this transcendental quality to it, which is in quite direct contrast with Otto, who put the numinous originally in the physical world and in man's reaction. I think it's something like whatever set him a start in wonder and astonishment in terms of the physical world as it was encountered, so the world of matter. And it's always struck me that Jung has really taken it out of matter and put it into the more nebulous ultraviolet end of the spectrum, almost like some kind of version of displacement upwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's interesting, in that in certain respects, Jung thought he was doing the opposite of that. I think because I mean he talks about the numinous as being something a very intimate experience, in contradistinction to the way he thought Otto was talking about it. Because one of the characteristics of the numinous for Otto is the sense of the wholly other. One of the phrases that he uses in characterizing the numinous, and so in other words, something entirely transcendent. And Jung thought that his way of talking about the numinous was actually bringing it more down, was psychologizing it, psychologizing in a positive Jungian sense, not sort of psychologizing it away, but introducing it into the psyche, and making it relatable as something very intimate for humans. So he thought he was actually bringing it down, but that's not. But your point about it being the physical, because that's still, he's talking at a psychological level there, I suppose, isn't it? But the idea of it, Otto having emphasized more the physical aspect of it is interesting. But what's worth noting in his characterization, though, is that when he talks about it being on the violet end of the spectrum, the ultraviolet end, he points out that you would expect it if there was a simple polarity between matter and spirit, and that you'd expect it to be blue. But he says it's not blue; it's violet, which is a mixture of blue and red. So it's actually got the sort of the instinctual in it. It's got the sort of physical end of the spectrum in it for Jung. And he even talks about it as being a sort of a return, a sort of return of the original instinctuality on a higher level, if you like. And I think he also uses the image of the Ouroboros as an alternative image that one might use to discuss this, as a sort of snake biting its own tail, to that the idea of the spectrum is in fact not something that is spread from a low to a high end, but is actually a color color circle, if you like. So it's an interesting observation, and perhaps it is true overall, but there's certain, I think there are complications in that view. I don't think he's straightforwardly doing that, because he's also bringing the idea of the numinous into very much into psychic life, and in terms of what he's doing in this paper, he's seeing the numinous as or the ultraviolet end of the spectrum as including, in a sense, the instinctual.
Yes, and coming back full circle, yes, I think that's definitely there, isn't it? But there's also that suggestion of trying to escape from the instinctual. And if you think about the location of the archetypal in matter, then you're straying into the realm of the primitive, and that becomes problematical in a whole other way.
Yeah, but I'm not sure he's trying to escape the instinctual, because I don't think at any point he's talks about cutting it off. It's more about sort of creating a certain sort of space of independence from it, but recognizing that in fact the energy is derived from the the sort of tension between the instinctual and the sort of spiritual end of the spectrum for him. So in a sense, it seems that both are equally important, if you like. He just doesn't want things collapsed into instinct, I suppose.
Yes, yes. As he talks about the idea of spirit, compares it to the archetypal polarity, but he doesn't talk about the spirit having a similar polarity. Talks about it having an analogous polarity, but not one that can span from matter to etheric, I guess.
Right. Well, he does say those sort of kinds of things in other works. If not here, then in Mysterium Conjunctionis, he pretty much says that. Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very.
If there's not another question at the moment, I'll just throw something in slightly, goes a different direction. Right at the very beginning of section 7 in paragraph 397, he sounds like Bion. He's talking about the lower reaches of the psyche begin where the function emancipates itself from the compulsive force of instinct and becomes amenable to the will. We've defined the will as disposable energy. So this echoes, I think, Bion's beta elements and alpha elements, that the beta elements need to be processed by alpha elements in order to be changed, what he calls from O to K. So from something that can't be known or spoken into something that can be known and spoken. I guess because with Bion, he sticks very closely to the clinical setting and so he says the analyst must become O. So in other words, the analyst must be overtaken by the sort of the unknowingness of the situation, and then there will be this transformation. But in that footnote to that paragraph, he says exactly who has the idea of the instinct in the unconscious state. So, in supervisions and in teaching therapists, like if you say, well, the analyst must become O, everybody gets very nervous. It's like, okay, so how is the will going to be applied here? Who's going to do something? And Bion seems to say, well, something will happen, but who it is, we have no idea who's doing it. But it does seem to me that Jung is kind of in a similar territory there, where he's sort of, how does something move from sort of pure instinctuality to something that can be thought and experienced and felt and so on. Anyway, that's just something that struck me reading it.
It's very interesting because it's interesting because when he's describing active imagination, his practice of active imagination, he says, doesn't he, that he didn't want to impose theories on it, so he's trying on what was emerging in these experiences, and he says this reticence was not made easy for me, since in many cases I was dealing with patients who needed an intellectual point d'appui if they were not to get totally lost in the darkness. I had to try to give provisional interpretations, at least so far as I was able, interspersing them with innumerable perhapses and ifs and buts, and never stepping beyond the bounds of the picture lying before me. I always took good care to let the interpretation of each image tail off into a question whose answer was left to the free fantasy activity of the patient. So he seems to be saying there something that he's trying to be in that sort of state of not imposing anything on the material. You know, he's at the same time as sort of, you know, acknowledging the needs of the patient, or so he seems to be saying in some way, but in, you know, he seems to be feeling his way into that sort of Bionian kind of territory anyway. To my mind, I don't know. I mean, you obviously know this better than I do.
No, I think they're very close.
Yeah.
But I guess the thing, you know, with Barbara, where you're talking about narrative, that makes me, I thought, oh, well, you're trying to turn Jung into an object relations therapist, right? Says it's all about story. I had the sense story is important to him, but there's something other than story as well. So, and that he's interested in how those things bump up against each other. Don't know if there are other comments, questions. Now's a good time to jump in.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
This is going on about stories versus archetype. But in the beginning in his career, he's very much relating, he's describing archetypes in terms of evolutionary patterns. So the connection between stories and archetypes might be here, that if stories are being told long enough, they gradually acquire an ontological form instead of just a cultural form. So they start to determine the landscape of the possibilities of perception of the world. In that way, gradually stories turn into archetypes. That would make sense in order to combine both your view of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's an interesting thought. The story becoming, taking on a sort of becoming ontological, as it were. Yeah. You mean you're saying something not just a cultural form, but something that is. I mean, I'm struggling a little bit. It's because, I mean, in the sense, would that then be something? How would that then be? Where would that then reside? That sort of is it in some sort of Popperian third space or whatever third world sort of?
Well, but what
or
I'm
is
really
it actually?
thinking of, and that's hovering above our discussion all the time, is how Jung is never sort of. One may have be facing an impossibility. Which reminds me all the time of the idea of the impossibility of projecting the world globe on a flat surface. And in a systematic way, if you see what's going on, if you try to do that, you always have to make compromises. You probably know this story about straight lines remaining straight lines and proportions being equal. And the third one is continuity. So I feel as Jung has been trying to tell deep truthful stories, and he is trying to cover even more deep, or to try to mend the compromises he's been making in his life in terms of trying to be more systematic about what he's been saying. He's doing everything he can, but he will face the impossibility of saying everything. And he's trying very, very hard to integrate and to remain significant and truthful in what he's saying. But in the end, what we're now gradually experiencing is the the rifts in between what he's saying. If you want to be truthful in what you're saying, you have to make compromises on the continuity of what you're saying. But that's why I feel they're always sort of managed, but irreducible inconsistencies between the way he's taking up terms. So I try to be sympathetic to him in the sense that that if you want to be really truthful and integrating, you just have to make. You can't be perfect.
Yeah.
And you'll end up with all these things that we're now carefully discovering.
Yeah. I mean, I think your point about that in this paper in particular, Jung is trying to synthesize a lot of his earlier thoughts and new thoughts that he'd been having, and it's probably an impossible task because he's trying to do. There are things which probably are inherently incompatible. I mean, does his biological view of archetypes really square with his more physics-oriented view? To mention but one.
Exactly.
So,
and perhaps the one thing that is not being integrated is the fact that he wants to remain outside in terms of what can be held in consciousness. So by way of a thought experiment, if you would really try to solve this problem or this imperfection, you'd have to turn into a mystic. Then you would lose the ability to be actually make pronouncements about this. But that's as far as you can go, wanting to stay an academic or something, or a human in a discussion about things.
Well, I can certainly see on the nature of the psyche as a rather lengthy koan.
Thank you very much for that. Carol, you need to unmute.
Yeah, I've unmuted. Hi, Roderick.
Hi, Carol.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working mostly clinically, so a lot of this is sort of reverberating with me clinically, and I have great compassion for when Jung writes in Memory, Dreams and Reflections, the idea that if he hadn't been able to find the images that were hidden in his emotions, he would have been destroyed by them. And a lot of this paper was reminiscent of that idea of how do emotional states come into another form whereby they then become a different sort of consciousness. But I mean, we're also talking a lot about the different sorts of consciousness that he's talking about here. And I've always found it really helpful, and just see if I can just find it for the moment, a quote that actually Panksepp, I bet you've come across him, who deals in primal emotions that we as animals share with animals. And in one of his key papers, he quotes Jung by saying, this is Jung, "I have long thought that if there is any analogy between psychic and physiological processes, the organizing system of the brain must lie subcortically on the brain stem. This conjecture arose out of considering the psychology of an archetype, the self, of central importance and universal distribution represented in mandala symbols." And I don't know why I come back and back to this, but I suppose I'm very moved by his images in the Red Book. For instance, that one where out of a snake, out of the earth, out of almost, you could say, the brainstem, you see this huge rush of energy and passion, and words come at the top. And then it seems to me he's talking about somehow making a connection between a very primal consciousness that we all share through our powerful animal emotional states, and how this then moves into higher levels of our brains, frontal cortexes, to form images and that take us forward from that state. I mean, I don't know if that actually makes any sense, but to me, I've always wrestled with this idea of the psychoid and this to me makes some sense between how consciousness is both this really primal thing, which is like knowing I'm hungry, knowing I'm angry, knowing I feel compassionate, to something that has images and maybe ultimately narratives as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's very sort of eloquently articulated. You know, I mean, Jung, I think that is a major thing that I get from this paper, and in particular from section 7 of it, is that when he talks about how you can't work on the instincts directly, or you can't sort of do anything with them directly, but through the image, you can understand them and you can work on them in a sense. And of course, he expresses it in quite a sort of abstract and theoretical way, which is why I like the much more vivid way in which you've just put it.
Well, which is in his red book, and I think that's why it's so fantastic, the red book being published now, because as he said, all of this abstraction actually comes from those years where he was going through a real sort of almost breakdown, but that opened his mind, and then he was able to theorize from, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Rohan?
Hi, Roderick.
Rohan.
Just tagging on to those last 2 points, really. I really like those last 2 points. Something that we haven't talked about too much, I suppose, is energy, or Jung talks about energy processes near the end, paragraph 441 and so on. Energy, obviously talking about libido and so on. And I guess you've talked about it before, Roderick, in terms of how energy gets expressed or described. I think it was touched on there regarding the Red Book, and also Bollingen as well, and a kind of representation of energetic processes. And I guess I wonder if one of the difficulties with this writing is it's an attempt at a description of energetic processes, and that's kind of hard to do in a written form. So I just kind of wanted to add that, really, because it seemed like the last 2 points were kind of hinting towards the nature of what Jung's trying to do with this book. And it's got something to do with connecting us to some idea of what energy means, whether that's in the psyche or in matter. He talks about energy, you know, from in terms of physics being quantifiable, but in terms of psyche, it being about qualitative. So 2 aspects of energy, but still energy. So I just wanted to bring that in, because that, you know, energy isn't something we've explicitly talked about so far, and it seems really crucial to his project here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. That's in the supplement, isn't it, where he talks about energy? It's right at the end. Does he talk about it earlier, or is it just there? Because I mean, is it just the introduction of physics that's kind of tempted him to take up this topic, or does he talk about it earlier? The
bit I'm looking at is later on. Yeah, I think in the supplement, paragraph 441, and I was kind of interested in it too, because it comes after the paragraph before, or kind of near the end of that paragraph. He's talking about essentially medically unexplained symptoms or physical symptoms, somatized symptoms. And he says, extremely common that medical cases in which certain clinical symptoms disappear when the corresponding unconscious contents are made conscious. So he's beginning to talk about energy in a kind of clinical setting there. I don't know if he mentions it before, but the bit I'm looking at is
I see the bit you're looking at. I was just wondering. I mean, this obviously is something that he writes about elsewhere. He wrote a paper on psychic energy, didn't he? And it was interestingly, it's a sort of an early theory of that. I mean, he wrote about that thing on psychic energy. It's quite an early paper, I think, isn't it? And it was sort of, it seemed to be with him all through his life. And I think here you can see the way in which he writes about it here as sort of explaining his interest in that concept in a certain way when he talks about you know, the term energeia and he sort of relates it to you know, both as you say, qualitative terms, and he points that the physics use of it, the more quantitative use, actually derives from the more qualitative use of it in you know, in other contexts. Even so it's a sort of, it's a term that he's using again in a qualitative way based on quantitative uses of it, but it itself, you know, has a qualitative origin. So I think that sort of encapsulates his approach to a lot of these things, to sort of find the psychic dimension of something that is more you know, that's become sort of objectified, you know, in science. And it raises, you know, it also raises I mean, on is that his final paragraph? It's his penultimate paragraph where he's even got a formula for kinetic energy thrown in there as well, which, I mean, there's something about his doing that and writing about physics at the end that you know, in the way he writes, he talks about, right at the beginning of the paper, he talks about how psychology used to be a sort of something that philosophers wrote about, the mind and the soul, or theologians. Now it's a science. It's become a science. That's his starting point. And then he talks about sort of, you know, he talks about instincts and so on. He wants to try and connect his notion of archetypes to biology, to ground it in one of the natural sciences, and he wants to ground it in physics in one of the natural sciences. There's that sort of attempt to connect his thoughts to science running all the way through this. And I think that way of talking about energy at the end is very much in keeping with that. Yeah.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up for today. Roderick, thanks very much for guiding us through this. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank everyone for the questions. It's yeah.
Thank you everyone for
and the discussion. I mean, it's been very helpful for me. Thank you.
So our next session is on the 15th of March, and the topic is persona. And Kevin Liu will be guiding our discussion then. So hope to see some of you there.
Okay, thanks a lot, David.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Bye, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.